the gypsy jazz scholars, and he was a player in the band Pearl Django, who plays gypsy jazz in town for a while. And now he's doing his own thing, his own compositions. He's a guitarist, but I don't think he's going to play today. He's going to present this as part of a grant that he got from For Culture, which is the cultural arm of King County, and about some really interesting Seattle-based composers, especially this guy, Frank Wldren, that goes way back to the 1920s, which was a shock for me. I had no idea. So probably you guys have no idea. So we're in for a good treat to really learn something in depth and also have a good presentation because they'll play some of the music for us. So if he's ready out there, let's just bring Greg Ruby. You there, Greg? Fisherman. All right, guys. We're good to go. So, big hand for Greg Ruby.
Alex Gilbert, and Jacob Zimmerman. All right. So today's presentation is gonna dive into the early roots of Seattle jazz music, but particularly through the lens of one composer, and I'm gonna tell a little bit about how I came across Frank Wldren and his book Syncopated Classic and kind of its implications to early jazz in Seattle. But before I do that, I'd just like to thank Cornish and the Composers Colloquium for having me here today. So thank you. In 2014, a few years ago, I received a artist grant to compose new work for a Prohibition-era style band. So it was a 6-piece group, and I debuted the work at the historic Washington Hall in September of 2014. So in my process, as I was creating my own work, so very much, composing pieces in that style and genre, I thought it appropriate to research into Seattle jazz and into the roots of Seattle jazz and just see what existed there. What I was hoping for was recordings, and what I was hoping for was a wealth of information and books and sheet music. And what I discovered was there was essentially nothing. In 1923, the Brunswick label traveled through Seattle and recorded the Vic Myers Orchestra at the Hotel Butler. Vic Myers and the Hotel Butler Orchestra. Are you all familiar with Vic Myers? No. Well, if you are, it may be as Vic Myers as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Washington. He probably one of the few jazz musicians that retired as a jazz musician to become a Lieutenant Governor. So anyhow, the Brunswick label recorded an early version of a few of his songs, and then essentially until the 40s, there was nothing recorded of Seattle musicians in Seattle. So this left this wide gap in my research of like, well, geez, what can I find? So if you can't find records, you can't find sheet music, you go to books. So I picked up this fabulous book, Jackson Street After Hours by Paul DeBarros. And as I was reading through this book, here, I'll read you a little bit of what I found. Let's see here. If you see on the right-hand side, the TIFF didn't turn out so well. It says Frank Wldren's Syncopated Classic. And below that it says 2 classic solos, 7 original syncopated novelty solos, 51 jazz breaks and endings, slap tongue, flutter tongue, laugh, squeeze, etc., as performed by Wldren himself, the biggest value ever offered to saxophonists. And what struck me were the words, as performed by Wldren himself. And further into, as I was reading through here, it said, it was probably during the First World War that Frank Wldren, born in 1890, came to Tacoma, where he played in numerous dance bands at Camp Lewis. And then it continues on. In the early 20s, the saxophone enjoyed a faddish popularity akin to the guitar craze of the 60s. Though the saxophone had been invented by a Belgian for use in military parade bands, it was popularized in America by African-American jazz musicians. And by all accounts, Wldren was a master of the instrument. He had a classic tone, perfect articulations, and masterful phrasing. In 1924, he published a saxophone method book, Syncopated Classic, in which he used 9 of his compositions, including Climb Them Walls, Pretty Doll, and With Pep, to demonstrate the new jazz techniques of slap tonguing and flutter tonguing. So what I saw here was, here's this book. I need to go find it. The challenge was it didn't exist in the Library of Congress. They did have a claimant card. It didn't exist in any local libraries. It didn't exist in multiple bookstore searches and rare book dealers. So it sort of became this grail of a search. So eventually I contacted Paul and was like, Paul, do you have a copy of this book that you mentioned? He was like, oh, that was 25 years ago. I think I might have a photocopy of it in my basement. And so I went over to his place, and sure enough, he handed me the photocopy and was like, yeah, here you go. Do with, whatever you want to do with it. That would be great. And so I took 3 of those tunes, and I arranged them for the performance that I did along with my original work at Washington Hall in 2014. So this was the cover. Very photocopied, and the 9 tunes that were in there. And I'll just play you, and this is one called Low Down, and I will play you what the arrangement of that tune turned out to be, so you can kind of get a taste of what we're talking about. So this was, it's a picture of Frank Wldren in 1915. This song is Low Down from his book from 1925. from Frank Wldren from 19. The recording I made in 2014 using the previous mentioned piece of sheet music, Lowdown, from Frank Wldren. But it was written in, I would say, 1924. And what I started to notice with this is it served a unique connection between ragtime and sort of an earlier period of jazz and early jazz, and also very much informing that process and gestation was happening in this very city where we live, and filling that unique gap. So after the yeah. The original score was just a piano score. Yeah, so it was as such, and we'll play some of those in a little bit as the original score. So it was likely that it could have been tuba. In a lot of the lineups that from the instrumentation of just looking at both photos of Wldren and his contemporaries, as well as some of the ledgers in a few of the newspapers, indicates that it was largely just the piano did. There was no bass player. It was often just piano, front line of trumpet and clarinet often, Wldren playing trumpet, and then drums seemed to be a common. I think the bass entered into it much later. So. Yeah, and many of the tuba players doubled on bass, and do you play tuba? No. All right. Should. No, it's not too late. All right. So following the discovery of this person, I put together. I wrote another for-culture grant to kind of research him specifically. So I'm going to go through a bit of his history, and then we're going to play some more of his compositions to kind of give you a context to some of the things going on. So he was born on January 14th, 1890, in San Francisco. Coincidentally sharing the birth year of the self-proclaimed inventor of jazz, Jelly Roll Morton. Are you all familiar with Jelly Roll Morton? Wonderful. I think Jelly Roll will enter into the story a little later. So Frank was born to Marguerite Walden and Frank Wldren. And Marguerite was a white woman of possibly French ancestry, and Frank Sr. was African American. Little can be located about when either of them arrived in San Francisco, but the 1910 census indicated that Marguerite's occupation was musician and that she was a widow. So it's likely that she raised Frank as a single mother. And in the 1922 San Francisco Directory, she listed herself as a music teacher, and it's likely she was Frank's first music teacher, and she was also registered in the voting records as a socialist as well. So this is lots of facts. But what was going on in San Francisco was pretty unique as well. A few years ago, he passed away since. Tom Stoddard wrote a book called Jazz on the Barbary Coast, and he. In it, he says, according to popular notations of jazz history, and the Barbary Coast was an area in San Francisco that was very similar to Storyville in New Orleans, in that it was a district of ill repute, you could say, where much jazz music was happening during that time. And according to the popular notions of jazz history, the dispersal of this music from New Orleans came after the closing of Storyville, the Crescent City's entertainment district during World War I. The facts of the case are more complex because singer-pianists Tony Jackson and Jelly Roll Morton were on the road long before 1970. Jazz on the Barbary Coast recognizes the presence of leading New Orleans musicians out west long before Storyville's demise, and the singular influence on musicians in San Francisco. So that it's likely, while not provable, that Frank Wldren growing up in San Francisco, was hearing a lot of these early jazz bands. Here's a picture of the Barbary Coast. And in 1912 is the earliest record that we have of Waldren living in the Northwest. He had moved to Tacoma. The Chicago Defender noted on October 2nd, 1912, that he performed the Goodbye song on cornet during the memorial service for the great Creole composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who had passed away on September 1st, 1912. And Waldron's military records show that his occupation was a musician, and in 1918, his place of occupation was the Olympic Hotel in Tacoma. Following World War I, he published his first piece of music. On February 25th, Waldren published The Kaiser's Got the Blues, Since Uncle Sam Stepped In, an original jazz foxtrot. Don't you love that cover? Sheet music predated albums by a long time. So I like to, just in the imagination of it, Alex Gilbert is going to play this piece right now, but just sort of listen for where you think, that ear pinching might be happening in the song.
Sorry, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Both pieces that they play, both the recording and this one, they seem to be in a rondo form.
Yes, a three-part rondo form.
Yeah.
Nearly all the compositions, with the exception of, I think, one, are in the three-part rondo form, which was, I think, a very common device coming out of the ragtime era. A lot of the songs, I think they called them strains. There was like the first strain, second strain, and third strain, yeah, it was quite a common usage. Yeah.
When it stopped being so?
Bebop? No. Swing? No. Yeah. When did the AABA form become the sort of standard bearer? Well, I think even before it, in terms of popular music, there was often a verse that was, of music of the 20s and 30s that preceded the other, that preceded the chorus, and eventually either musicians didn't know the verse, and so they just played the chorus, or it just got, the form got abbreviated for a period of time. But I think that also allowed for a much less orchestrated and a much more improvisational spirit to that. Have any thoughts on that, Jacob? Wonderful. Okay, so Waldren showed up in Seattle as early as 1913. He's listed in the city directory as musician on 1242 Jackson Street. This location soon became the Waldren School of Saxophone and Trumpet, and also the center of Seattle's emerging jazz scene. This is a picture of Frank Waldren with the Wang Doodle Orchestra from 1915. Pictured from left to right is just a person named Hughes. We don't know his first name. Ace Brooks, an unknown musician there, Frank Waldren, and Cody Jones. I find this photo interesting because I did not expect early jazz musician to show up with three mandolins, and also on the floor is a harp guitar. So it's kind of a unique instrumentation. But as I continued through the research, it was much more common. African American string bands were prevalent during the ragtime and early jazz. In New Orleans, it was common for a horn player to also double on a stringed instrument, playing quieter string music in the cafes during the day and then louder horn music at night. And this is James Reese Europe's Society Orchestra, pictured above, with a small ensemble of Reese's Clef Club Orchestra. It consisted of banjos, banjarines, which were a unique instrument to the time, piano, cello, drums, and the group played a sophisticated repertoire of ragtime, waltzes, and marches. And interesting enough, as I was sort of looking at this photo more and more, I became obsessed with these two instruments, the mandolin and the harp guitar, because I feel like the instrumentation sort of informs what that band may have sounded like. And the mandolin and harp guitar and the Wang Doodle Orchestra were actually built by a Port Townsend builder, Chris Knutson. And he made three models. He made the Seattle, he made the Port Townsend, and he made the Tacoma. And these two models are indeed the Seattle models. So, but then when I went back and looked at, and I found the harp guitar a very surprising instrument in early jazz. Like how did that find its way there? But indeed, James Reese Europe's Clef Club Orchestra used the harp guitar. It actually had an entire harp guitar section. And Europe's one of his published pieces. But it's the waltzes that Waldren performed with the Wang Doodle Orchestra continued to be an inspiration throughout his career, leading him to compose several of his own. So this is from the Syncopated Classic book, and this is Valse Hawthorne. Let's give a big hand for Jacob Zimmerman on saxophone. False hopper. Prohibition began in Canada a little earlier than it began in the United States, as early as 1917, and many jazz Americans took the opportunity to head north across the border, as the work in the cafes paid very well. In 1919 through 1921, Oscar Holden's band held residence at the Patricia Cafe with Ada Bricktop Smith on vocals. Both musicians had relocated from Chicago and the vibrant scene that was there. The self-proclaimed inventor of jazz, Jelly Roll Morton, joined Holden's band for a few months in 1919. And amongst historians, according to Jelly Roll Morton, he was the band leader. But according to Holden's band had been established at Patricia for quite some time, and came in for a brief few months. Yeah. The Hotel Patricia was in Vancouver. Yeah, yeah. And I think on Street. And so it was Morton Vancouver later on in 1921 to lead a trio with drummer Doc Hutchinson and clarinetist Horace Eubanks at the Hotel Irving. And in the June of 1923, Eubanks recorded in Chicago with Morton on some of his first recording sessions. So I'm just gonna play just a short snippet. So this is probably like the jazz that was happening in Vancouver. This would probably be the closest recording to what may have been going on there. So I'm just gonna. Waldron was also located up in Vancouver during the same time. And he performed for the grand opening of the Lodge Cafe at 556 Seymour Avenue on December 22nd, 1920. So, and with numerous other musicians. So, while Morton's travels took him to the center of the recording industry in Chicago to capture his sound, Waldron never recorded, and nor did Oscar Holden. He did leave us a collection of his compositions in syncopated classic. His work embodies a transition from the ragtime era to early jazz, and it's likely that he composed many of these songs during the years preceding the publishing, and possibly as early as his time in Vancouver. As contemporaries, the quality and detail of their work indicate that both Morton and Waldron were dedicated composers. I like to think that Morton may have dropped into the lodge on more than one occasion to hear Waldron's band performing his own work. So we're going to do Waldron's composition, Go Get It. And right before we do so, I would like to mention the intro on this is one of the more fascinating intros throughout his work. So. Go get it. Now, a number of interesting things start to happen in this piece, particularly in relation to the other things going on in early jazz, and one is the use of the rhythm section in this sense, the piano accompany of really accenting the twos and fours. It's a very common device that you can hear on some of the Louis Armstrong Hot 5 recordings, as well as Jelly Roll Morton's recordings, and also a very prevalent use of the triplet is used heavily throughout, and also introducing he uses the laughing technique in this piece. So Waldren stayed at the Waldren's stay at the Lodge Cafe continued into 1921 with the Chicago Defender reporting. Later that year, prohibition was lifted in Canada and the gigs dried up. Many of the musicians left Vancouver for Seattle, Washington. Jelly Roll Morton went back to Chicago, and Wldren and Oscar Holden made their homes in Seattle. Wldren returning back to Seattle, and Oscar Holden making his venture down here. Returning to Seattle, Wldren established himself as band leader, teacher, and composer. That's a picture of him at the with the Odeon Jazz Orchestra at the Nanking Cafe at 1616 and a half 4th Avenue. So throughout the 20s, he was Wldren fronted the Odeon Jazz Orchestra at the Nanking Cafe, typically downtown venues, and this was approximately where. Let's see, 1616. That would be like 4th and Pine, approximately, right in that general area. Typically, downtown venues were off limits to non-whites. Wldren successfully crossed this color line, evidence that his high level of musicianship and business savvy commanded respect from both the black and white jazz and music communities. On March 30th, 1925, Frank Wldren registered his book Syncopated Classic with the United States Library of Congress Copyright Office, and later that year it was printed by the Rainer Dauheim Company in Chicago, Illinois. I went to the U.S. Library of Congress and found these. It was a very fun adventure. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Here's the cover. All cleaned up, Frank Wldren Syncopated Classic. Wldren published Syncopated Classic as both a method book, introducing techniques of the era while using his own compositions as vehicles to learn those techniques. The book advertises itself with 51 jazz breaks and endings, slap tongue, flutter tongue, laugh, squeeze, etc., as performed by Wldren himself. As performed by Wldren himself clearly suggests that not only these techniques, but he performed these very songs. Here's one of his songs, Pretty Doll. And this is one that I had recorded back in 2014, so I'll just play a little bit of this. The structure of this is a little bit different than the others in that he doesn't use the three-part rondo form. It's just more of a verse chord. It's just a two-part, almost like a A-B with the B part repeating throughout. So. This is a picture of 12th and Jackson, right around the corner from Frank Waldron had his shop, or his teaching studio set up, and Prohibition was a lucrative time to be a jazz musician in Seattle, and attracted many musicians from around the country. The great Creole clarinetist Joe Derensborg said, "Word spread around among musicians that you could make money in Seattle. It was a money town. You went to work in a joint there and you always had $45 a week guaranteed. The house usually had a kitty cast out of plaster of Paris and painted. It would have a big mouth and they put a light in it. You had a lot of silver dollars in those days, and people would throw $1 into the kitty and hit a little level inside and its eyes would light up. People got a kick out of that, seeing that cat blink his eyes. That's the way you can make your tips." So this is there's only 3 known photos, this being the third one of Frank Waldron. And it's a promotional photo from 1925. Has Waldron seated with 2 other significant musicians from early jazz, both Adam Slocum Mitchell and Glover Compton, relocated from Chicago to Seattle during Prohibition. Glover Compton was he was a ragtime pianist who performed with numerous musicians throughout Chicago and the West Coast. But it was actually Glover Compton who was in Paris with Sidney Bechet during the famous Bechet incident. So there was a guitar player, Mike McKendrick, who apparently Sidney Bechet and McKendrick got into a disagreement over chords. And Bechet, so indignant and angered by this conversation, pulled out a gun and went to shoot Mike McKendrick over this disagreement, at which point Glover Compton intervened and got shot in the leg, as well as a passerby of the whole situation. And so Compton spent some quality time with Bechet in a Paris prison for about 12 months. And apparently the two didn't really like each other much after that. And Waldron is also seated with Adam Slocum Mitchell. And as we saw earlier from the Sid Laprodi's So Different Jazz Band from San Francisco, has Adam Slocum Mitchell in it as well, and he was a clarinetist from Martinique. So this is sort of setting the scene that these significant but yet lesser known players were circulating their way through Seattle and working with Waldron at the time. So Waldron introduced unique saxophone techniques like squeeze, slap tongue, and laughing into this piece, Climb Them Walls. So we'll go ahead and hear that piece. So there were a few specific techniques in there. The first was the squeeze. Could you demonstrate the squeeze?
Yeah, this is something that I've never seen before, and it's something that I kind of had to imagine what it was supposed to sound like. But I assumed that squeeze, he was just meaning a very like pinched sound. So instead of like a normal, I'm just trying to make it sound as. Just a little tight and thin sounding. That's unusual. I've never seen that before.
And then the other is a slap tongue.
That was like a very, very common technique for all saxophone players, 20s and before. And I think that Rudy Wiedoff was kind of the virtuoso saxophonist of the day who could do all kinds of really crazy stuff with his tongue. And he was a specialist with slap tonguing. And there's this little bit that you can watch a video of him and this other saxophone player, Benny Kruger, there making the saxophone sound like a hiccup. He's asked, like, what do you think of Prohibition? He's like, oh, this is what I think. And he makes this really wonderful slap tonguing sound. That sounds a lot like a hiccup. It's pretty wild.
And then there's also the flutter.
Which most people just do by making the same sound you do when you roll your R's.
And also laughing. He used laughing as a...
That's another thing that Rudy Wiedoff was very saxophone, where there was a lot of sound in it.
And there's the one spot I think in the right before in the second section where it's a flutter to a laugh. Climb them walls.
So how did he notate these devices?
The
He-
laugh, it just says ha ha underneath each note. You just say ha ha ha.
If the resolution on the my image there was a little more, had more clarity, you would have been able to see that. My apologies about that. But yeah, he would just put the word ha, and then for the slap, it would also often just say slap and dot 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 dot, or for the duration of which those techniques would carry through. Oops, let's see here. Oh, Prohibition ended. After Prohibition, the more lucrative work for a musician dried up, but Wldren continued his teaching studio, mentoring the next generation of Seattle's great musicians. His students include Quincy Jones, Buddy Catlett, Jeb Ward, Ronnie Pierce, Duke Wilson, Sonny Booker, Barney Hilliard, and even New Orleans clarinetist Joe Derensborg once took a saxophone lesson from Wldren. A few things that some of his students had to say. Quincy Jones, of course, was one of the star trumpet students of his. He said, then we finally got a trumpet teacher named Frank Wldren. He was an African-American with a bald head, and he used to wear striped pants, like the guys in the English Parliament. He looked like he stepped out of the Harlem Renaissance. He had a little flask of gin, and every night he'd take a sip 3 or 4 times, and he said, "Let me hear you play something." He was from a legit school of trumpet players. And Buddy Catlett, who later went on to play with the likes of Louis Armstrong, took lessons from Wldren on reeds in the 1940s before switching to bass. He said about Wldren, if you came to your lesson and you hadn't been practicing, you'd be sitting there sweating bullets. He'd say, you'll never play with Duke Ellington if you keep going this way. And local legendary saxophonist Barney Hilliard. I actually got to I got to chat with Barney a little bit about Wldren. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Barney Hilliard by name, he would have been the first saxophonist in the Northwest to honk out the notes to Louie Louie. He played with the Dave Lewis combo way back when, and they were the first local group to bring that tune to prominence. He was primarily a R&B musician, but a great player. And he said, Wldren, he would sit on his piano bench and talk me through all the fingerings. He would also say to me, if you keep working with me, you'll play as well as you'll ever want to play. Charlie Parker can stand up and play along with an orchestra without music, and I can teach you to do that if you keep working with me. So Wldren was very prolific with his student base, and I think a lot of the musicians who worked with him continued through to be part of later time of Seattle jazz. So we're going to do another of Waldron's compositions. This is one called With Pep. With pep. So as I continued on through searching out Waldron's work, which I contacted through a mutual friend, David Sager, who works at the Library of Congress music library in Washington, D.C., and searching for were there any additional Waldren compositions that he may have created. And so the way the Copyright Office worked at that time through now is you would publish, when you would copyright a piece of music, you would send them 2 copies, and they would put them in storage until it was published, at which point they would mail one back to the composer and mail one to the person who was actually publishing it. And for each of these compositions, there was a claimant card. And in the Library of Congress, there is a very large card catalog of separated by decade. And sure enough, in the card catalog, David Sager was able to locate another of Waldron's pieces, and it was a valse, Queen Anne, and you can see the piece here. I think let's do just can we just play the intro and the first strain of it? It's another 3-part rondo form here, but you get a chance to see Waldron's, his own handwriting on this. And while the intro says for piano, there was no accompanying piano music for this piece. So we're just gonna do just the first little bit here right now. When I was leaving the U.S. Copyright Office, and so when you go in, they bring these pieces to you in a giant manila envelope, and it's like, it's not quite like a white gloves kind of space, but it's very quiet, very studious, and very serious. There are like musicologists and ethnomusicologists just looking through each piece very carefully. And so they said, if you could please wait at the table. So I was sitting there just waiting at the table, anxiously anticipating the piece, and they brought the folder over to me, and it was incredible to sort of connect with this piece of sheet music that had been in storage for the last 80 years, and kind of bringing it back into this whole story of a local musician. But on my way out of the Library of Congress, and when I handed this folder back to them, one of the curators said, "Oh, do not send this back to storage. This deserves to be in the special collections here," because this guy, Frank Waldren, was an important but unknown figure in Seattle jazz. And the guy kind of looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, one of his students was Quincy Jones." And the guy was like, "No way." So it was a neat little moment. And this whole venture has sort of been filled with one coincidence after another. And so as I was, right after I recorded some of the Waldren pieces with the Rhythm Runners, I was telling a neighbor of mine about this whole project and about Frank Waldren. He went, Waldren saxophone quartet. And I just looked at him like, tell me more. And he was like, well, a bunch of years ago, I was tearing apart an old house. I was hired by a contractor in the Central District to clean this place out. And it had been old, and there was a bunch of stuff there. And we were just to take it to the dump. But there were like all these like kind of cool things. And at the time, I was going up to Waldren Island in a good bit, and I found this thing. It was like some type of drink tray, and it said Waldren's Saxophone Quartet, 1936. He's like, I am certain that would be the Waldren. So, unbeknownst to me, he had this relic of Seattle jazz history in many ways. So it's likely that it was just a drink trade, an after-hours party that either the proprietor, the owner of the house, would carry around beverages advertising Frank Waldren's quartet. And it says on there Orsa, which I still haven't quite been able to figure out what that might mean. But myself and my neighbor and friend, we donated this piece to the Washington State Black Heritage Society, so it's now part of their permanent collection. So, in conclusion, Frank Waldren served a unique role in the early jazz of this city, and I think in early jazz in general. And he fell into a unique time when there were no recordings happening in this area. Seattle was pretty far away from most of the urban centers where those things were going on the East Coast and Midwest, and even Los Angeles was quite a haul. But he and other musicians had a very rich and vibrant community, and I find these pieces important because they archive a glimpse into that time, as well as just showcasing a beautiful musical mind, and I feel that they're important for people to hear. So we are going to conclude this presentation with one more Waldren composition called That's It. Thank you. That's it. Thank you, Jovino.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for bringing a very interesting thing. I was just going to ask you, did you ever check with Ken Wiley? You know who Ken Wiley is?
You know, I think I communicated with him, not directly, but I think via Paul.
Okay,
Yeah,
because he's the guy that has all these recordings.
that's right. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
visiting our class. And
All
good
right.
luck with your project.
Yeah, thank you so much.